And we want to continue the conversation right now on how race plays into the recent police shootings across the country, which presumably led to the shooting in Dallas last night. Joining us now, Dr. Neal Lester, an ASU professor who teaches courses in African-American issues and how they relate to American culture. Dr. Lester, thank you so much for joining us. And what an important conversation and a tough one to have at the same time. And the big question here, how do we get past this? How do we have that dialogue? How do we move past this?
Well, one thing I would suggest is that we not talk about getting past it, but rather go back to see what led us to this point. And part of that is sort of looking at the history of what people are talking about. And the thing about race, this conversation about race, is that it's not just about race, it's about race and economics, race and lack of access, race and gender. So there are all kinds of intersections that need to be put into this conversation rather than imagining that we can somehow take a magic pill and get past it and start from scratch. Unfortunately, we can't do that because we have something called history, and the baggage of history will continue to follow us unless we unpack that and see what all those pieces inside are.
And we were talking, it's just a real shame that it takes such a tragedy like what we've seen this week, all the things we've seen leading up until today, bring us to a conversation which we should be having these every day.
Well, it's interesting because I'm certainly not an advocate of violence, but there is something about violence that gets people to hear, and people will take note. Now, the question is, what do you do now? Because Black Lives Matter does not mean that other lives don't matter. And that's what I see, is people actually coming together and talking about violence is not the answer. Marvin Gaye said that in What's Going On, violence is not the answer. But it does get people's attention. And now that we have the attention on lives mattering, what do we do? So there has to be policy, there has to be an awareness that we all have these biases and prejudices. And if we have the power to create these systems of injustice, those have to be dismantled. And you can't do that unless you acknowledge that, yes, in fact, there's a problem. We can't imagine that we have a black president and that racism doesn't matter anymore.
Well, all we can hope is these kinds of conversations are going on all across the nation tonight.
I think they are.
I think they are. Hopefully we'll...
Peacefully.
Exactly, absolutely. Peacefully. Thank you so much, Dr. Neal Lester, for joining us tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
And as you